So I'm going to give a couple of quick updates to everybody, and then I'm admitting people as we're talking, so sorry. And
It's
just,
okay, Bev. I'll admit people for you.
oh, thank
Don't worry
you so
about it.
much.
Yep.
Thank you so much. And a little bit of quickly about the resources that we have that are being updated as well. Remember that this is a continuation of a wonderful, wonderful talk that we had by Bing Wills, and then Dana also joined us from our Sjogren's group. So this is a continuation of that, just about under and over binning, and some other discussions that we had about how do we incorporate binning and winnowing into our process, and how do we move that forward, and some of the questions that people had. Hopefully you had a time to watch the video, but if not, I think important to do that after, so it'll give you an idea of what the introduction to those questions were. So I think that's important for everyone. I think all of you would have received a message now that we've moved from Turkey to Barcelona. Well, 30 minutes outside Barcelona, Shauna always tells us. And apparently it's amazing. She's been, and everyone loves Barcelona. So we're looking forward to that. And I always say, hard to believe that's only a little over a month away. Crazy. But the groups will be working hard
A year.
A year and a month.
I mean, sorry, a year and a month.
Yeah. Just give me a heart attack, Bev.
I meant to say a year away. So yeah, it's crazy. Time goes so fast, not that fast, but fast. And some resources. I think, oh, that's Robin. I think Bing had mentioned that we were incorporating the binning and winnowing into some of the work from our chapters, and Shauna has been, amazing, and everyone on our handbook group just updating some of the chapters and workbooks now. So stay tuned. You'll be getting some information about that soon, but this process has gone into that chapter 4 as well. And then all the wonderful stuff that we have on my favorite part, I always tell people, the OMER Ed is the learning modules, and we've kind of moved into putting some of the method stuff in there. The domain selection, instrument selection are in, but there's also this amazing patient engagement Kathy's on if people have questions about anything for that module. But please share these modules with people within your working groups, because I think they really learn a lot about the history of OMER, and there's a training on facilitating, and there's going to be more. So stay tuned, because I think Shauna has plans as well for several more in the next little while. So we're going to be working on those in the next few months. Lots of resources on our website. I'm always sending people to the website for things, but also the newsletter that Shauna does. And if you have things that want to go into the newsletter, please feel free to send it along to me, and I can make sure that gets put in if you're doing surveys, or some people have announced meetings that they're having. So it's a good resource for people, and you should have gotten that monthly. If not, let us know. Any questions? My next slide is just to say the next town hall is May 21st. But any questions on that before I turn it over? No. Great. All right. So Bing, Wills, and our lovely Dana has also joined us today to go through, and Sarah's on as well. So we've got lots of groups who are going through this process of binning and winnowing. So Bing, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm not going to go through the slides that I had last time. I think the recording from last time is available, and we just sort of summed up the concepts of binning and winnowing, and talked about how that can be important in terms of narrowing down your list of potential domains that would be included for voting, with really the goal to be presenting in Adelphi a manageable number of domains that people can actually rank. And we have had examples from groups where they went into an initial round at Delphi with over 100 different quote unquote domains. Which is really an impossibility for anyone to rank. When we look through those, some of those examples, it turned out that that a lot of the items that were being included, or the, what were called domains, were actually different pieces of similar concepts that could be put together into bins to make voting on them easier. So that's sort of the concept of binning, is taking things that are similar and related to a singular concept and sort of wrapping them all up into a single domain that might have a little bit broader meaning. The other thing that we realized is that in looking at many of the things that had been included in a domain or in a domain voting piece for Adelphi, is that many of the concepts that had been identified were either frankly irrelevant to the disease under study, or were very nebulous in terms of what they were, and in terms of not really falling into a category of any type of thing, or even were double-barreled, where there were two concepts that were being looked at or within a single thing that was being presented at Adelphi. So the second piece of this process is what's called winnowing, which is throwing out those things that don't really fit into categories or are not clear or somewhat nebulous in terms of what they're asking, because they don't have really a good definition behind them. So those are sort of the general concepts of this binning and winnowing, where you can take these, use these processes in your domain reduction to come up with a better list. And then Wills had presented the work of scleroderma, where he actually started with winnowing and then did binning after it. And that certainly is legitimate. And in sort of reflection after Will's presentation, I think that that strategy might actually be a preferred one for many people, to go through and see what just doesn't make sense and throw those out, or take those out at the first stage. I think one of the things that's really important is that if any group is going through this process of binning and winnowing, the rationale for the decisions that are made and the documentation of that is very important. And why decisions are being made in terms of either taking things out of the Delphi, or the ways in which things are being grouped together. And those become the type of things where it's important for the group to work together and include all of the different perspectives when those decisions are made, and documentation for that, so that there's not any question at any point that these are being sort of made by fiat. That members of the group are involved in that type of decision making. So I think that's, I'll sort of end there in terms of sort of background for the people that weren't on the last call, to bring you up to date. And I think, Wills, maybe if you can sort of, go over sort of briefly what you covered before and the lessons that you learned, and then, and then Dana, maybe you can do the same from the Sjogren's perspective.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And Wills, just to clarify, that was the lupus work that you're going to present.
Yeah. Should I just go ahead?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
You should be able to. Awesome. Thank you.
Great, yeah. So this was the list of preliminary candidate domains that we came up with. And there's a few examples here of overbinning. One of the big ones you can see is emotional health is way too broad a category. And I'll show you that one. That's my example of overbinning. Other ones that we are still discussing are cognition. And we're thinking of breaking it up into actually the quantitative, like cognitive function domain, where you just take the quantitative measures of how it is actually functioning, and then more of a cognitive impact on how it actually impacts the patient's lives. And I've gone to talking to a few patients recently. They like that breakdown of the domain. And there's always the health-related quality of life domain. That's always under discussion as well. But I'll go through our examples really quickly. So Yeah, so we had many items. We winnowed out a bunch at first, made more sense. And this is my example for disease activity. And these are examples of items we winnowed out that didn't quite just fit. They were a little too broad and not specific. And so we winnowed quite a few items before we started our bidding process. And then we had quite a few themes like these ones. These are the ones that made it into a disease activity. Um, and like we bin them and we get our domain. And this is kind of one example we're pretty happy with, though there is more discussion, but we liked all of these under disease activity. It made sense to us. And this is one of the domains. We were very satisfied of how the winnowing and bidding went. But when we're talking about overbidding, our example is emotional health. And here are a lot of themes that we had that kind of all were related to emotional health. And I think emotional health makes more sense as a broad domain. And here you can see there's three I wanted to highlight. We had anxiety, depression, and stress, all of which have their own measurement instruments already like established that have been used in the lupus field before to target those domains or those items individually. And people have referred to them as domains on their own. So having them all grouped together into here definitely makes a way too broad a domain. And so yeah, so we did bin all this together under emotional health, and this is our one example of overbinning. And at the time it made sense because we thought all these are quite related and there is a lot of overlap, and how can you distinguish one from another, especially if they're interplaying and impacting each other, because emotional health and is quite complex, and we didn't want to miss anything. We thought if you take it all together, they use a large composite measure, maybe you could gather it, but we think that we've changed our minds kind of where it's discussing that still. Yeah, that was what I had the question, like how do we prevent or handle overbinning before getting too granular, because we don't want to break down domains too much and then have items that are no longer important that don't make the core outcome set because they're too specific. However, we don't want to overbin and have an item that's meaningless because you're capturing way too much and you can't actually use that. So that's what I had when we went through last week. Let the discussion go from there.
So I have a couple of questions, and this lends itself to exactly what we're trying to figure out in the Sjogren's. So Wills, you gave an example of overbinning with the emotional health, like you can't really apples and oranges, anxiety, depression, stress, etc., into emotional health. How are you going to then measure it in a meaningful way? But then I was surprised because this is the exact conversation we're having with disease activity. So if you have lumped together, like I'm trying to figure out, how would you even measure this? Soreness with skin rash, with feeling swollen, like how does that pan out then in the next phase of this? Because I would think that that's too lumped together too, but I don't know, because I can bring up, actually, I could share my screen, because then we had our Sjogren's meeting yesterday and we were talking about this. So we decided to go back and look at examples of everyone's core domain set that's already been established. So I pulled up the vasculitis one, and I guess it's working out for them, but let me just pull it up on their screen. Their onion, 1 second. Am I able to share the screen?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay. Oh wait, my button's changed.
Oh, that's what Shauna was talking about, everything.
Okay. All right, hold on, share. All right. Do we see the PowerPoint?
Not yet, but it's coming. There. Yep.
Okay. So this is exactly kind of what you were just talking about, Wills. So as their core domain set, they have disease activity, also just very broad impact on quality of life. So is this an example of overbinned? I mean, it must be working out. Maybe. Does this mean that they're all composites then?
Bev, I don't know if you want to give an update, but so I can quickly say that their onion was endorsed a long time ago. So before we had all of these sort of things in place, this is fairly new because for the reasons you're exactly saying. This is, you know, as they move into instrument selection, it's going to be a bit challenging. I know they're developing a composite. Is it for disease activity, Bev? I'm not sure.
It is.
Yeah, I think it is. So
Um,
that's the question. Like, and I guess, right, because if there isn't one already in existence, then you're making a composite, which just is very complicated and time consuming, which is fine if that's what needs to be done. But when you group them together, is this then ultimately what's going to happen for our group, for lupus group, etc.? I think Dorcas,
Dorcas
Robin.
has her hand. Yeah, Dorcas?
I don't know if this is the right way, and I look forward to seeing what others are saying. But one way I think about it is what they wanted to be able to capture and measure and quantify in a core set was disease activity. And then disease activity for them is only measurable by a composite of certain elements of disease activity, certain features of disease activity. So so that kind of makes sense. The disease activity might be a core domain, a target that you're trying to measure in a clinical trial. Emotional health is kind of a different example where the target domains might be things like depression, anxiety. You could see just measuring those things and just being interested in anxiety in a given disease. So that helps you think about what do we want to be the measurable unit in a core set should be what's listed in your core domains. And so emotional health is where that's just too broad because you don't want to measure emotional health. You probably want to measure depression or anxiety or self-efficacy.
Yeah, individual targets.
Right. Yeah, I guess my question, and this is just an, broad question, a rhetorical question. How is emotional health too broad? Which I agree it is. And how is disease activity not? If it's going to be, like a couple of different components coming into play. And then how do you decide upon that? So
that's why we're having these discussions, because these are good, thoughtful things we need to be thinking about.
And then the other thing we started to talk about last week was, do you potentially segregate life impact from disease activity, and having two different Delphi processes? So I don't know. Bing?
Yeah, I think Robin had his hand up first, but
Sorry, Robin.
I'll respond back to that when I get my turn.
Robin?
Just to clarify, since I'm a member of the AAV responder criterion group, not to brag about that, just to level out some confusion, let's be aware that although the group is presented as a composite group, that's not what the money was paid for. That was for responder criterion. So it's very clear to both Gunnar and Peter Merkel that we should not necessarily stick to the domains that are mandatory from OMREC's perspective. They have asked all the new stakeholders to reconvene what should be in responder criterion. So that's actually, I think, aside from what these meetings are about. Although your points are very well taken, I've argued that repeatedly. Wouldn't it be fair if all the domains at least were taken, like the rate and PSATE scores in other conditions, taken into account? But that's a very different discussion, because Peter and Gunnar don't think they need to 100% align with what's already consensus.
Because that was the EULAR and ACR responder credit. That was their project, right?
It's still ongoing. We haven't published anything yet.
Not finished yet, yeah. So it's interesting that you picked that one up, Dana.
That came up yesterday.
Have a chat with Peter Merkel and your institute there. Bing?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about, to also think about some of other groups that have tried to look at how we look at clinical outcome assessments. And I think if you look to the sort of the ways that the FDA is framing this, you really need to start with a conceptual framework of what it is that you are trying to measure.
Right.
And I think that that's important because you have this construct, this concept of emotional health, but clearly within that, there are all of these other types of things, and you have to think about if you were ultimately to develop a way to measure that, would that be a composite where you had, multiple different pieces of this that were being measured into one composite instrument,
Yeah.
where you had either a formative or a reflective construct, that you were going into for that measurement system? Or would you instead say that emotional health was represented by these different domains, anxiety, depression, whatever, and each of those would have its own instrument of measurement? Now, I sort of suggested last time that I think, that we may not be able to get everything we want out of a single Delphi, because a Delphi is a way for us to identify sort of the meta areas that are important for us to measure. And by splitting out anxiety, depression, and all of those other components of emotional health, you run the risk where you would have votes being split amongst those different areas of emotional health, such that none of them would rise to being important to measure, which clearly is at odds with what our patient representatives would tell us, and I think what we know from our clinical experience to be the case. So this idea that perhaps you have something like emotional health that gets prioritized and rises to your thing, then you may have to go through and again, I'm just proposing this, I'm just putting it out here. I haven't run this by anybody else. But where you would say, okay, among those areas within emotional health, how do we prioritize within that? What are the things that would be most important for us to not miss? And where we would have this possibility of even measuring or developing a construct that we could measure. Because I do think that this sort of, a measure of emotional health, well, you could say, well, SF-36 mental component score is giving us that, but is it really? Because SF-36 MCS is putting together anxiety and depression and fatigue and all these other kinds of things into that score. That's not really reflecting emotional health. It has a name on it, mental component score, but is it really measuring that construct that you were trying to say is this thing of emotional health? And I think the answer there would probably be no. Other people would argue differently. But if we look at the domain frameworks, right? And I go back to the PROMIS framework as a way for people to orient themselves. You see that there is a meta domain that's called mental health. And then within that, there are these subdomains, which are each of themselves, in and of themselves, each a singular concept for which that you can measure that. Anxiety, depression, again, and I think self-efficacy actually falls under the social health domain within the PROMIS framework, but each of those things would be able to be measured independently. But I do think that this concept of maybe moving to sort of a second analysis or a second time, a second type of prioritization exercise, once you have something like emotional health that gets to your thing, then you get a little bit of a research agenda that is to define what does emotional health mean and how are we going to break that out. That might be one way to move that forward. So I'll stop there and happy to hear anybody else's perspectives.
Awesome. And then Will, you also had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about more about lupus specific, like very much what Bing said. I agree with that. And I think like if we're talking disease activity for lupus, it's such a heterogeneous disease and no patient presents the same, that even to diagnose it, they require multiple different symptoms, like a certain amount of score to come together. If you're like looking at SLEDAI, for example, and we need a number of symptoms together to even get a diagnosis. So I think if we took all those individually, like we just took rash alone or like low complement or ulcers, those would not make the core outcome set. They wouldn't be quite important enough, especially to patients, a lot of those. Some would, but some would not. And if you put them together in disease activity, now you have a nice, meaningful domain that kind of captures that aspect. Meanwhile, like, yeah, emotional health is way too broad. So it's like, if we broke disease activity down, we might be underbinning and separating it too granular. Wow, that's just for lupus, I think. And meanwhile, yeah, emotional health definitely overbinning. And so I think it's a domain dependent, which, how much you break it down, and your disease specific as well.
Any other questions or comments on that?
I thought I saw one other hand up that was earlier.
It was Karine, but you.
Karine, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of put it down. I wasn't sure. So I guess the only point I wanted to bring was, I wonder if patients who voted on the core domain set, like said disease activity, or they had in mind like specific elements of disease activity, like were these defined well or not so much? Like I wonder, because like disease activity, I find is I don't know, I think clinicians tend to say disease activity as one thing, right? But then like for patients, often it's like a mix of different things. So I think it amounts to the same thing, but the reality is maybe you put disease activity in the core set just to say this is one domain, but really it's like a melting pot of many different things. And it all depends on each individual patient will have it, different elements in that. So I don't know if maybe it's the same thing I'm saying, but I just wonder what patient partners were thinking, when they like approved the core set. Were some people really pushing for certain things in the disease activity or disease activity as a whole? I find like, and I wonder what other core sets have done too. Do they put disease activity as a melting pot? Or I don't know. That's my question. I guess there's no answer. I don't know if you guys can answer.
I know I'm thinking a lot about, I really like Bing's idea about sort of like a prioritization exercise. And it's really tricky to try and figure out if it should come before your full Delphi or not. But if you do it before, like he said, you run the risk of doing all of this extra work on these domains that maybe don't even get voted high once you run through. So you spend all of this time on all of these domains and all of the sort of pieces that make it up, and then it doesn't even get voted. So what a waste of time. But then on the flip side, if you do this prioritization exercise after of what pieces should make up the domain that, sort of got voted into your final set, then is that enough to say it's endorsed by enough people to bring it forward into your final core domain set? I don't know. But I mean, I think it's an important exercise that, I'm not sure we've seen groups do before.
Well, but we have in a way, okay? Because if we look at the vasculitis example that you've given, right? Disease activity got up there, and health-related quality of life got up there. The research agenda for those things then is to define, how it is that you're going to measure those things, right? And
so you would do it after, like, so as you move into instrument selection, you mean you'd be starting to
as you move into instrument selection, again, there's sort of this intermediate stage where you then have to define, and you have to put definitions and words around what that concept means, and you have to develop a conceptual framework around what it is that you wish to measure, with your exemplars of things from patient perspectives and others that go into making that definition, so that you can then say, does your instrument match to the domain? Well, you have to define what that domain is. So I actually think that, it's sort of, we don't talk about it as a separate step, but in fact, it is the step that we are going through when we were developing those quote unquote definitions, which I would argue is a conceptual framework for what you were measuring. And if you think about it as a conceptual framework, that ties into sort of the FDA regulatory approach to this, where that becomes the thing that you need to demonstrate that your measurement instrument is actually reflecting. So, emotional health, you recognize that, you have these two strategies that you could say this is going to be a composite measure of emotional health that's going to reflect X, Y, and Z, or you are going to say that emotional health equals depression and anxiety and others, and that these are going to be the ways in which you measure and address that.
So you could see emotional health going both ways then, Bing. That one group might want sort of an overall sort of composite of any of these features of emotional health going into one outcome. And another group might want to specifically focus on an element of emotional health.
That is deemed to be the most
That's
important.
deemed to be the most important. Yeah.
I'm just, again, I'm throwing these out as ideas. None of this is written anywhere, but just sort of thinking practically.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with that we need the good definitions for each of these so that we can really make sure we measure them well.
Sarah? You're on.
So this is, a really interesting discussion, as Dana is indicating. So I'm getting back to sort of this question of, do you prioritize before or after? And Wills, it's great that you have a disease activity domain. Ours right now, if we included all of the domains that our experts and patients wanted, would have 16 domains. And to generate, and already we have the SDI, which is a tool. And if you haven't used it, or an instrument to measure our current disease activity, it's a mess because it's too many domains as it is, and this would add domains. So we're really sort of unhappy with how everybody is using this as a kitchen sink. And so what we were thinking of doing, and I wanted to run it by the group, is not only prioritizing, but sort of clarifying to the group, because we had a lot of great input, but I think that a lot of people wanted to see every single thing you see in disease ever included in our disease activity, which is not appropriate, right? Like it needs to be something that in your head as a clinician, when there's active disease, you're seeing these phenomenon. So Wills, we'd heard that you'd done a survey to the group. And we were hoping to do this in an objective manner because past Sjogren's domain generation exercises, they elicited response from experts and just generated a disease activity domain without, total consensus. And so we want more consensus, but we want to phrase to the group, like, let's prioritize these disease activity metrics and winnow them. So winnow them in an objective manner. So I don't want them, a lot of these I don't think should be included in Adelphi because they're just not associated with activity at all. They happen and they're burdensome to the patient when they occur. Like one is GI involvement with constipation, right? Or probably for lupus, there's headaches. But it's not necessarily associated with activity unless you have meningitis or, something like that. So I just kind of want your thoughts on what, if you think that's reasonable, how you might go about doing it and how you refocus the group to like, this is not a kitchen sink exercise. We know that many symptoms occur and are burdensome, but we really need to hone in on the features that are associated with disease activity. Just take thoughts.
And then also just to piggyback on that, just come back to this disease activity concept, we feel like the entire project could be just disease activity and just disease activity for the next 10 years thinking about it. So how do we judiciously manage to winnow that down, or I guess bin, or going back to Bing's comment, and then the vasculitis example, if we have it more broad, and then that serves as the framework later, I can imagine that every disease working group is going to have generically health-related quality of life, potentially with emotional health, and then disease activity, and then the other one was biomarkers for many of them. That was the vasculitis core, and then when I click through other disease groups, that's kind of what essentially that is. So do you do that now, like as part of the Delphi, and then push that through and then spend conceivably years trying to sort out what that means? Or do you truncate that and try to organize that in the beginning before you send it through? And then what are you doing in lupus, Wills? And maybe we'll follow you.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I had told him that you had done a wonderful survey that's just being.
Yeah, that's why we're really here, Wills.
Our survey, we just asked about the domains from the 1998 Lupus Core Outcome Set and Research Agenda, as well as 8 other domains that are commonly used in lupus now that weren't considered back then. And we just asked everyone to rate them. And it went as expected. The domains that everyone still knew and liked, like disease activity and health-related quality of life, we didn't change them really much from back then. They scored really high. But the domains that people didn't understood, or ones that clinicians thought weren't too impactful, like that impactful, were definitely lower scoring. One of the lowest scoring was economic cost. But that's what we saw, and very exactly when you see the domains that you'd expect, and the patients preferred the life impact, while clinicians preferred like adverse events and damage and like markers of activity and remission, kind of. So that's what we saw. But I think it's very hard to disease activity is a complicated topic, and where do you draw the line? And yeah, there are some new items that kind of be put under disease activity, but they're not really covered under like the lupus disease activity index, and we're not sure, do we throw them in there, in which case would we need a new measure, or do we leave them out and just define disease activity as what we already have in the lupus disease activity index, or what do we want to do? And we haven't decided yet. And this week, actually, we have a meeting to really work through this. I've been gathering all what we've been discussing here, and I've been working on the past 2 months on how to define this, and we're going to really decide how we're going to proceed. So probably at the next meeting, I can inform you what direction we're going. But right now, we have not decided yet whether we're going broader and like composite measures or breaking them down. I think we'll be doing a bit of both. Honestly, I think it'll be domain specific, whatever makes the most sense for us.
Annalise has her hand up.
Yep, Annalise for a long time, sorry.
I actually want to go back to the concept or the idea, the process that Bing raised, and mention the ICF, because it's exactly the way also the ICF, the International Classification of Function of the WHO, works, and it reflects the struggles that many people have that want to define health or measure outcomes, start measuring outcome, and it's exactly what they do. So the construct could be emotional health, and then you have the different, they call it categories, and so there is already some consensus what emotional health could all be, and as well did, when you have all these elements in your larger construct, emotional health, actually what the ICF says is make sure that what you measure is typical for the disease and relevant. And then further reducing, there is also the group of the patient preference group, where we discuss the IDs, how to reduce when you have your construct, when you have the different items that you feel are really relevant and should be considered. You still have methods such as DCE or even statistical methods for disease activity. How do you reduce the items that you have defined? There is also an end in which you can define them by opinion or by qualitative research, and then you sometimes get those strange formulas such as the disease activity scale of the DAS28. But in reducing the items, there is also, I think, a lot to think about how we will do that, following the winnowing. And that's partly the discussion we have now. We cannot solve everything, I think, by the qualitative research, but that's what I think.
Annalise, you had last talked about this living data set as well, how Wills could sort of build on that. I like that idea. Do you want to tell people that one?
Yes, so what what we did with the ankylosing spondylitis core set of elements that define health is we kept them, and we use still that database of the larger concepts and the sub-concepts or the aspects or categories, whatever you call them, of subdomains. We kept them and we still use them, for example, to develop an instrument such as disease activity or such as health-related quality of life. And in the ASOS group, it was considered quality of life. We combine, similar as in the SF36, we combine the mental and the physical health. And physical health is also measured separately, but mental health isn't. It is part of the construct health-related quality of life, because the disease itself, of course, also you get anxiety and depression and frustration, but it's not very typical for the disease. It's more what you see in all chronic diseases. So we didn't define emotional health separately, but as part of the larger construct, health-related quality of life. But and in addition to the domains and the subdomains, we linked items from existing questionnaires to our data set to have an item data set. I think it's the same as PROMIS does, or similar as PROMIS does, but it is also an inspiring approach to use the ICF or the PROMIS as an example and make repetitive use of it. I think it's the same as Bing said, but a slightly different background from the ICF.
Yeah, I think we, you know, and Annelies, I mean, when we've written the chapter, I think we use both ICF as well as PROMIS and recommend that when people are doing these exercises, that they try to tag on to an existing framework. And certainly, you know, ICF or you know, PROMIS, which is broadly based on ICF. It's just not as detailed down to the chapter and different levels. But you know, trying to tie into those frameworks to look at how, you know, we already have these constructs developed, so you don't have to recreate the wheel in redefining what things are.
In a group like Sjogren's, where you're really trying to get everybody to agree, even though they want all of their things with equal importance, in your whatever you're working on, could you do just like a ranking exercise with some really clear criteria? Like, here's, like, yes, we'd love to include every single thing, but that's not real. So we need to pick you need to pick 5 or 10 or whatever it is, whatever you decide. And like, this is what we're trying to get to, and we want, you know, everybody's input and stuff like that. But as a way to try and make some informed decisions, I don't know if anybody's done that, but.
So Shauna, that's exactly what we're talking about doing and modeling after what Wills did. And listening to this conversation is helpful. And so I think Wills specifically said, I can write a survey that says, you know, rank which factors you think are markers of active disease that would get better when the patient is in remission. I think that's a clear way of doing it. And then also within a succinct time frame, because ultimately I think it gets forgotten that these are things that have to get better within the time frame of a clinical trial, correct? And we have things like cavities in our, which is big and like that reflects salivary flow. And I tried to take it out and I got a lot of pushback where people were like, that's important, you know, you need to include it. But, you know, we have a lot of things that I think over time, because the community hasn't been involved in Sjogren's, there is a lot of push to take a more comprehensive approach that's open to everybody in the group. But it ultimately leads to, I think, too many domains.
Yeah. And I haven't seen the lupus survey, so it could be doing exactly that, which is, you may be able to just copy most of it. Should be great.
Discrete choice experiments are also used for that purpose, and there is an OMERACT group that has experience with that.
Can you clarify that a little bit, please?
Then in discrete choice experiments, it's like ranking, but it's even more precise to know also the distance between the first and the second ranked. And you ask physicians or patients considering health-related work quality of life. So you can do it with a best worst scaling, and you present 4 items that are part of the, I don't know, 20 items that explain emotional health, and you ask them which one is most relevant for emotional health in patients with SLE, and then they can rank the ones that are two that are very important and 2 that are least important. And if you repeat that questionnaire with the 20 items and you repeat that choice for the 20 times, then you can get a formula, and that provides you insight into the the kind of ranking, but on a granular level, not 1, 2, 3, but 1, 1.5, 1.8, 2, and you can choose in the end what is most relevant for to define emotional health.
And Annalise, that would make it a simpler task, right? Because they're only having to rank 4 things
instead of 20.
Instead of 20. So then they're doing the cognitive load would be less on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so just to clarify, those 4, if I look this up, I presume I'll be able to figure this out, just not knowing this. But so if we have 20 domains, I would just would I do 4, 5 times, or would I have to do, how would you overlap that? Because that actually sounds like an attractive way to approach this.
There is actually, there is a program that helps you to choose smartly how the different blocks of 4 subdomains should be presented to get with the least number of choice blocks that the participants receive, the highest ranked numbers. And you can see if you do it and you have then the rank of your 20 items, often you see a gap between those that are really quite important, really very competitive, and pain and stiffness, mobility, that's very close together in spondyloarthritis. But financial problems there, you see a bigger difference between the previous ones, and at a certain point you say, oh, their relative importance to the total importance of all the 20 items starts to be really, really low, and you can sometimes see your cutoff of which are really important and which are less important.
Yeah, AXPA did that, Sarah, so we can get that for you.
So there's a lot of different combinations, multiple.
Is this like the 1,000 Minds stuff that Peter was talking about too? Okay, okay.
I would love an example of this. This is amazing.
A great example.
I think this would be good.
A great example would be the EULAR-ACR classification criteria for lupus. That was led by Dr. Sindhu Johnson, and when they've just redone it, I think too. But when they did that, they used discrete choice, and what they did is they would give each person a choice between 2 options. They made a huge list of items of what could be like symbols of activity or symbols of lupus, and they would put 2 in randomly into one box and 2 into the other, and they'd say, which one are you more confident in diagnosing with lupus or saying they have more serious lupus? And you went through a bunch of choices, and the 1,000 Minds software took that and analyzed it and was able to discern which items people were most confident in diagnosing with lupus versus less. So even if you don't know yourself, the 1,000 Minds software kind of figure out what's subconsciously or something you were thinking. And yeah, so the EULAR-ACR classification criteria for lupus is a great example of that, if you want.
And also Dana, Peter Merkel's group, the AAV group, that's what they're using as well.
Okay. And the main message I want to say now is that it is still very important to be very clean on the different aspects, subdomains, whatever you put in your construct. But at a certain point, you need to go a step further and let you help by other approaches. That's actually what you cannot you cannot arrive to everything that is important simply by consensus on qualitative research, I think. But it remains very important.
I'm just giggling because Annalise, that's getting right back to our initial thing of you have to winnow and bin before you just can't put garbage in and expect an answer to come out. You really need to be thoughtful about what you put into these
Exactly.
exercises. I wanted to highlight that in my understanding of the vasculitis group, and George is on too, so he can comment on that too. The DCE can be used for this selection of domains. You might also, which it sounds like they did with the EULAR criteria, but it might also be used for weighting of the domains. So when we were working with vasculitis and their application of DCE, it was around the weighting of the domains within a composite measure that they were really focusing on how to make use of that. So I just wanted to clarify that, make sure that when you're looking for it, you're getting at the selection of domain exercises as opposed to the weighting.
Yeah, the only example I could find is the slides that we showed at OMERACT, but it's all around like what Dorcas just said, the weighting. I don't have any other examples to send along, Sarah. Sorry.
I'm so excited. This is a really great approach. I think that the way you describe it, it sounds like exactly what we want, where we'll see separation of what the majority of people see as activity. And in a simple exercise, you're right, ranking 20 things would be exhausting. Nobody would want to do that. So just
I completely agree. Thank you so much for this feedback, because I think we really have hit limitation and group consensus. And we're kind of at a standstill right now. So I think this is a nice method that could potentially help break through that.
Perfect. Dorcas?
Can I ask, you were saying earlier that there's certain features of the domain you want them to be thinking about. Is it likely to change? Is it an indicator or something that's looking at disease activity and will go up and down with disease activity? And so if there's those kind of attributes of these elements that you want them to be thinking about as they do their discrete choice, not to add more work onto a survey, is there any value in trying to sensitize them to that they look through this list and maybe they're given a little checklist? Is this likely to change within 6 months? Yes. Is this likely, so they can sort of in their own mind get used to these domains and why they might up prioritize or lower? If they don't think something's going to change, then maybe when they get to that item, they might downvote that because they've already been sensitized. I don't know if that's a worthwhile exercise or.
I like have a checklist on the side as a reminder for each.
Almost like as they're going into the survey, have them go through here are the domains and how we're defining them. And we're asking you to think about these things. Can you just rate them now? And yeah, and then they get into the DCE, but it might be too much burden.
No, that's I think a reminder in any way is really important, especially as they go through these multiple comparisons. So I'll think about how to incorporate that in. I'm just really excited by this suggestion. Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions or good suggestions?
It's very exciting because this is why we want to have town halls, is because we can help each other with our experiences.
Yeah. Okay. Nope. Well, thank you to Bing and Wills and Dana for coming back the second time around. This is amazing for having conversations, and I'm in the working groups and everyone brings up the town halls and the methods pieces that are happening now. So if you have a suggestion for a future methodology specific issue that you would like us to present, please let us know and we can prepare for that. The next town hall is, as I said, May 21st at 8 a.m. Eastern time. And thanks again. If you have questions, please feel free to send them along at any time. We're always at the end of those. So unless not, we have 3 minutes to go. So thank you so much. And Bing, thanks again, Wills and Dana. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.